All right. We are recording, so wonderful. Good evening to you all, brothers. It's good that you are here. If you are able, if you have the data, if not, if for some reason you're working off of data and not Wi-Fi because you've lost power, not a problem. But if you are able to, I would encourage you to go ahead and engage your cameras, and it's a lot more fun when I'm teaching to be able to see the face of the students than to see a black screen. Now, if for some reason you're unable to because you're using your phone data as opposed to Wi-Fi, don't worry about it. That's fine. I'm not going to require it as part of the class, but if you are able to and so inclined, and you can engage your cameras, that would be great. If not, it's understood. So all right. Well, Rocky, with your permission, I'll go ahead and get us started with a word of prayer. All right, great. So let's pray together, brothers. Father, thank you for this day and this evening, and this morning for me, but this evening for the rest of us, that you have brought us through another day. We reflect upon the events of this day, and we cry out to you words of gratitude and thanksgiving that your providence has ordered our lives to this point, in a way that may be filled with struggles, difficulties, and points of sadness, but also a reflection upon your mercies as you have given us our daily bread. You have provided us with life and breath and opportunities to serve you. But above all, Lord, we thank you for Jesus Christ, who has laid down his life for his sheep, and who continues to intercede on our behalf in heaven above, whose righteousness is our own, both now and forevermore, irrevocably so. And so, Father, we pray that we would honor Christ as Lord here now, setting him apart as holy in our hearts, that he might be indeed the one who reveals himself to us to guide and to lead us in the way in which we think, in the way in which we help, minister, and serve you in the church, and even unbelievers as we seek to share with them the gospel and to defend the faith once for all delivered to the saints, that we might be prepared and made ready to have a defense for the hope that is within us. Help us to that end, in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Great stuff. Good to have each of you with us this morning, and it is a delight to have you. If I think I might be getting a little bit of background. Oh, there you go. Okay, great. Thank you, Richard. Perfect. Again, the announcement, if you weren't here before, that I made earlier is if you are able and you have Wi-Fi connection, please do engage your cameras, so I could be able to see who I'm talking to. And once again, as always, if you have a question, you can do that virtual raising of your hand. I believe that Zoom has an option for raise your hand, or you can drop a comment or a question in the chat, or otherwise. And I'll be keeping an eye. Let me open up my chat so I could keep an eye. They just change this thing all the time. All right, here we go. Okay, I have an eye on the chat. So if you have a question, comment that you'd like, you could drop it in there. And Rocky, if you have done such a great service to our class with some of the notes that you've been dropping into the chat for us. And if you're able to continue with that, great. If not, no problems. But that was so very helpful. Thank you. All right, just to get us up to speed as to where exactly we're at. So we're talking about the need for the reformation of apologetics. And so that's where we're heading. And I'm setting the backdrop. I'm giving you the historical context of apologetics throughout the history of the church. Again, just a very brief overview to give you a sense as to what the discussions are through the history of the church relative to apologetics, the defense of the faith. And so as we talk about how Christians in the past have defended the faith, what we're going to do is take a critical eye, an appreciative eye for sure. We're not going to dismiss the history of the church. We're not going to blow it off as if it's unimportant and as if we just arrived on the scene of the kingdom of God here in the 21st century. We're going to appreciate the history of the church and the history of apologetics, but we're also going to have a critical eye towards it as well. And the question that we're going to raise is whether or not the task of apologetics has been fulfilled as well as it could be over the course of the centuries. And so as we look at that history, taking a critical eye towards it, what we're going to do is offer at the end of this portion of the class, we're going to begin to offer a proposed way in which we can reform the task of apologetics that brings it into greater conformity with Scripture as we understand the Scriptures from a reformed confessional perspective. So we are Reformed Christians, and we want to be able to think about how to do apologetics in conformity with and consistent with our Reformed convictions, in so much as we believe those convictions are forged by the teaching of Holy Scripture. Okay? So that's where we're at, and that's where we're heading. And as long as we're all tracking okay, then I'll go ahead and press on. If you remember and you recall, last time when we met together, we were talking about apologetics in the early church, and we had gotten up to the point of Augustine. And when we get up to the point of Augustine, we want to recall sort of the two ways in which apologetics had been offered leading up to Augustine, who lives, of course, at the end of the 4th into the 5th century. And Augustine manifests one of these two ways particularly. If you think about apologetics having, number one, an eye towards defending the faith against unbelievers, you'll remember the way in which apologists in the early church had an eye towards the pagan, unbelieving Roman Empire. The pagan, unbelieving Roman Empire was persecuting the church. And so, sort of the defense that was so frequently raised among apologists was, hey, listen, Christians are good citizens. The Bible tells us to pay our taxes to Caesar. The Bible tells us to honor the king. And so we're told in Scripture to live quiet and peaceable lives. And so they're good citizens. Leave us alone. Tolerate us. That's the argument. There are other arguments as well, but that's one of the prime arguments used to defend Christianity towards unbelievers. Now, there's another form of apologetics that we see both in Scripture and in the early church, and that is what we've called polemics. So I'll go ahead, and I see Rocky has dropped off, so it may be he lost power. So I'll put some notes in the chat. So polemics is, again, the idea of defending the faith against false forms of Christianity, false teachings. And particularly we saw in the early church the way that Greek philosophy influenced the thinking of the church to such an extent that there was a syncretism between Christian thinking and pagan thinking, and that formed heretical doctrine. And so what we see both in the Bible and in the early church is an attempt to defend the faith over against false forms of Christianity. Excuse me. Now, by the time that Augustine comes on the scene, Augustine is a very interesting character. We can't nearly get into the details of his life now, but I just want to highlight a couple of things. Augustine is particularly known for his defense of the faith over against Manichaeanism, which is the form of pagan Greek philosophy that he was delivered out of. And Manichaeanism is sort of a pseudo-Christian cult that is informed by Neoplatonism. Can't get into Neoplatonism at this point, but Augustine was very influenced by Plotinus, who was a Neoplatonist, and so that was sort of his Manichaeanism was his entree into Christianity. And it wasn't very Christian, of course, but he eventually meets a bishop by the name of Ambrose. I'll pop the name in there. Ambrose of Milan. Ambrose of Milan. And Ambrose was the one to teach Augustine true Christianity. He was his early mentor and taught Augustine true Christianity over against Manichaeanism. Now, when Augustine begins to write, I mean, he's got a number of writings that are so very important. One is that he's defending Christianity against pagan attacks against Christianity in the city of God. So in the city of God, the issue really is whether or not Christians are to blame for the sack of Rome, right? So the Visigoths come along, they sack Rome, and the Roman Empire falls, and Christians are the scapegoats by pagan Romans. And so in the city of God, Augustine is trying to provide a defense of Christians and Christianity over against the pagan arguments that Christians are responsible for the sack of Rome and the collapse of the Roman Empire. So the City of God has so much more to it than that. It's a huge book, of course, classic. Read it at some point, even if you go through it slowly, and it's just a classic that you need to have under your belt. But another classic of Augustine's, of course, is the Confessions. And the Confessions is sort of an apologetic as well. It recounts Augustine's conversion, where he came from. It's autobiographical. And he gives a defense for some Christian doctrine in there, including the Christian doctrine of God, and sets the doctrine of God over against the pagan notions of God. And so, and the gods, right? So the mythology and so forth and so on. Augustine is given an apologetic of Christianity over against paganism. But perhaps Augustine is most well known for his defense of Christian orthodoxy. His defense of Christian orthodoxy comes in the wake of the Council of Nicaea, and Augustine wants to defend Nicaea, and wants to defend Nicaea over against the Neo-Arians, those who are continuing to support and contend for the old heresy of Arius, and we talked about Arius before, the way in which he denied the full divinity of Christ. And so Augustine is, particularly in his great book, De Trinitate, is wanting to give a defense of the Orthodox doctrine of the Nicene Orthodox doctrine of the Trinity over against Arianism and Neo-Arianism. And so there you have a very clear testimony to polemics as a form of the defense of the faith over against in-house Christian false teaching or Christian heresy. So that's sort of Augustine. Now, as we move from Augustine onward, we find ourselves quickly transitioning into what is oftentimes described as the medieval period. And in the medieval period, it's approximately a time of 1,200 years, 1,100 years, really, about approximately 400 AD to 1500 AD. And it's a period of time in which a lot happens, but and particularly in the church, it's oftentimes called the Middle Ages, medieval period, or sometimes called the Dark Ages. And part of the reason why it's called the Dark Ages is not so much because there was no Christianity during this time. Of course, there was, and many good things happened during the medieval period. But oftentimes described as the Dark Ages because it's with the collapse of Rome. You have the burning of libraries, the dominance of the Goths. You have a time where Christians are so oftentimes made to run, as it were, and to flee from civic persecution. Many Christians find themselves in monasteries as priests and monks. And it's actually in the monasteries during the Middle Ages where the scriptures are preserved, writings, early church writings are preserved, until the rise of the universities during the late Middle Ages, middle to late Middle Ages, and it's during that time where we begin to see, with the increase of universities, education, academia, we see light beginning to dawn until finally we get to the period of the Renaissance and then the Reformation. Um, but the Renaissance, of course, is late Middle Ages, but oftentimes it's described as the Dark Ages because it's a time in which education, academia, knowledge, certainly the broad spread of knowledge is all but suppressed. And so it is called that, but we don't want to, and the reformers called it the Dark Ages too. The reform, you may be familiar with the Reformation expression. I'll put it in here: post tenebras lux, after darkness light. And so even the reformers saw the period before the Reformation as Dark Ages, as an age of darkness, because not because there was no Christianity or anything like that. Of course there was, but their contention was that the gospel had been lost, particularly as we move into the middle to late Middle Ages, or the middle to late medieval period, where the corruption of the church had become such with the Pope, and his particular schemes, the way in which there was a lack of discipline among the priesthood and the bishops, and particularly the doctrine of merit and the way in which grace had to be merited in order to have justification. The reformers saw that as a period of time where widespread throughout the church, particularly with the authorization of the Pope and the great theologians, maintained a false gospel, which is no gospel at all, of course, right? And so during this period, oftentimes called the Dark Ages, we see that there is a suppression of widespread education, academia, and knowledge. And there is also the suppression of the true gospel during this period of time. And that's why it's called the Dark Ages by some. So there are two figures that I want to talk about during the Middle Ages that are particularly important for apologetics. That is I'm sorry. Let's start out with Anselm. I misspelled it. I'm so sorry. Anselm and Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas. And these two thinkers, Anselm and Aquinas, are very important figures during this period of time because they develop the apologetics of the church. And but they have a particular method in which they go about defending the faith. And they have very different methods of defending the faith. And I'm just going to highlight for you very briefly here what those are. And I'm going to give you enough information so that you can go research some more on your own, but also be able to track with me as we get to the time in which we're talking about the need to reform the practice of apologetics. So if we're talking about Anselm, Anselm developed what is called the ontological argument for the existence of God. The ontological argument for the existence of God is basically, it goes something like this. And you can find the argument in what is called his proslogium, which is one of his works. And in the proslogium, he talks about how do we know that God exists, right? And he has an eye towards the fool, what he calls the fool, taking his lead from Psalm 14, Psalm 53. The fool has said in his heart that there is no God. And so Anselm is looking to give a defense for the existence of God over against an atheist. And this is what he says. Here's the ontological argument in a nutshell. I can conceive of that which nothing greater can be conceived. Okay, so in other words, I can think of something that is the greatest thing that there is. Okay, I can conceive of that which nothing greater can be conceived. I can think about the greatest thing that there is, above which there is nothing greater. Okay, that gives you a little bit of a sense as to where the beginning of all of this is. Okay. And so then he says this, the next step in the argument is this: that which nothing greater can be conceived exists in my mind. It exists in my mind because I've thought of it, right? I thought of that which nothing greater can be conceived, so it exists in my mind. Okay. Then he goes on to say, but if it existed only in my mind, but not also in reality, then it would not be that which nothing greater can be conceived, because it's greater to exist both in my mind and reality than to exist only in my mind, right? So are you tracking with him? You're tracking with the argument, right? It's kind of a clever argument, right? So I can conceive of that which nothing greater can be conceived, which means it exists in my mind, but it must also exist in reality, because to exist only in my mind but not also in reality would mean that there must be something greater that I can conceive of, namely something that would exist both in my mind and reality. So if I think about that which nothing greater can be conceived, it exists not only in my mind, but must also exist in reality. That which nothing greater can be conceived is what we call God. Therefore, God exists in reality, and therefore he exists, period. That's the argument. That's the argument to prove the existence of God. We'll offer a critique of that in a little bit, but let's move on to Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas makes another argument. It's called the cosmological argument. Cosmological argument. And the cosmological argument extends from what he, in his Summa Theologia, that's the Latin name for his great work. The Summa Theologia, basically a summary of Christian doctrine, is what that translates into in English. He has what he calls the 5 ways. And the 5 ways are the 5 ways in which we come through a process of natural reasoning, we come to a knowledge of the existence of God. Okay? Now, for Thomas, that process of natural reasoning is a kind of process that that takes place in light of the things that I experience, okay, that I perceive with my senses. Let me give you an example. With my senses, I can see cause and effect relationships. Cause and effect relationships. Okay. So if I trace back what a series of causes and effects, I trace that back far enough in my mind, just by way of reasoning, And I must conclude rationally that there must be a first cause that caused everything else. So if cause and effect relationships that I perceive within creation, okay, goes back infinitely, then it actually makes no sense of cause and effect relationships at all, because it's just an infinite regress. And you never get to the point where there's a first cause causing all the other effects, right? So he concludes that there must be a first cause that itself is not caused. He calls it the uncaused cause, right? He'll also call it the unmoved mover. Okay, there must be a mover who himself is not moved that sets everything in motion. You see? So God is this one, he says, that is an unmoved mover. And since you can't have an infinite regress and speak about movement or cause and effect relationships at all, then you must conclude that there must be an uncaused cause, an unmoved mover who moves and causes everything else that comes to exist. Okay. Now, this idea is for Thomas Aquinas, is very much built upon some presuppositions that he has. And some of those presuppositions have to do with notions of the way in which reality is structured. Okay. Thomas Aquinas understands that reality is structured in such a way that there is I'm going to put this in the chat, a chain of being. Okay, let me explain the chain of being notion to you. Think about it. I call it a chain. You could think about it like a ladder. Okay, think about climbing a ladder or descending a ladder, or stairs, if you like. Okay, at the top of the ladder, you have God. At the bottom of the ladder, you have non-being. Okay, God is pure being. Okay, at the bottom of the ladder, you have non-being, things which don't exist. Okay, and there is an order of descent from God down to non-being. But what holds God and everything that descends down from him in common, what holds them together, is the idea that they all share in being. Okay, they all have being. God has perfect being. He's the being that doesn't need anything else to be. Creation, everything that now comes down out of God, okay, is dependent upon God for its being. And so what you have is a hierarchy within creation. God's at the top, right? And then you have descending down from God, everything else that exists in creation. And then you have some beings that are closer to God because they have less physicality, less material to them. Like, for example, angelic beings. Angelic beings are much closer towards God because they're spirit. They don't have physical bodies. And then descending down beyond that, right? You've got human beings. Human beings are really good. They're at the top of the pecking order, if you will, at the top of the chain of being, because they have souls. They have immaterial parts of their being. We have souls, but we also have bodies. And then below human beings, you've got things like animals, and then inanimate objects like rocks and dirt, right? Until finally you get to the bottom of the chain of being, beyond which there is only non-being. Okay, so everything extends on this ladder from the top, God's perfect, unmoved being, all the way down to non-being and everything in between. Okay, so creation is the kind of thing that has being, but it has less being than God has. God has infinite being. God has eternal being. But we, the creature, right, descending from God, have limited being. We have finite being. But we still have being. And that's the thing that holds us in common with God, his being. Okay. So when God creates, things descend from God in a process that is called exitus. I'll put that, that's a Latin expression, exitus. And you could see the word exit in there, which means to come out of, right? So all of creation descends from and comes out of God. Okay. And as it descends and comes out of and from God, okay, in this process of exitus, right? Everything that descends gets less and less and less and less being to participate in, okay? But everything participates in being, but to a greater or lesser extent. Angels are like at the top, you got humans below the angels, animals, so forth and so on. But it's all coming from the being of God. It all flows out of God, okay? In a process that is called exitus. Now, a part of the problem is that when you get to man, okay, man is created with a problem. For Thomas, man is not created sinful. It's not like he's created with a sinful nature, but he does have a problem. And part of the problem is that he has a twofold structure to his being. On the one hand, he has these higher appetites. These higher appetites are things like reason, logic, right? These are the things that have to do with the mind and the soul. And these are good things, and they sort of orient Adam, or the first man, Adam. Reason and logic orient man towards God. But because man has a body, has a physicality to him, has material to him, there's also these lower appetites. And these are the kinds of things, these are like animalistic carnal appetites, right? And these are the things that drag man down. It's what Thomas Aquinas called concupiscence. I'll put concupiscence. I think I spelled that right. Concupiscence is a natural drag on man that pulls his being down towards non-being and away from God. Logic and reason, these are good appetites. They pull Adam up, okay? These are also the things like knowledge, natural knowledge, natural holiness, natural righteousness, that end up getting added to man's higher appetites to try to pull him up towards God. This is what is called the donum super additum. The supper is, that's one piece, super additum, the donum super additum. It's the super added gift that stuff like knowledge, righteousness and holiness, this is the image of God that pulls man up through his higher appetites like logic and reason. Okay. This is necessary. The donum super additum is necessary for Adam before the fall in order to lift him up towards God and to offset concupiscence, which pulls man down. Okay. So remember, everything's on a ladder, right? And the ladder, or the hierarchy of being, is very much a Greek philosophical notion. Okay. The whole exitus scheme, right, is set upon the presuppositions of a Greek notion of metaphysics and of the nature of reality and of being. Okay. So what is metaphysics? Again, metaphysics is a study of being. It's a study of what is and how it is and how we're to understand being's nature. Okay. There's a pull upward, and that's the donum super additum. And then there's a pull downward, and that is called concupiscence. And for Thomas Aquinas, man is in the middle, and the question is, will he sink down towards non-being and cease to exist by caving into concupiscence, or will he allow himself through an act of will to be freed up? Okay, brothers, let me take a break here. I got to take a phone call, and I'll be back in about 5 minutes. Okay, thanks. Okay, we're back. Sorry about that. I have some work being done on my home. We have a roofer that is here putting a new roof on our house, and so that will be going on. If you hear some loud noises, and you'll know exactly what that is. So apologize for that interruption. Okay, we're just going to go to 8 o'clock, so just another 40 minutes or so from here, and then I'll let you go until next week. But okay, so we're talking about Thomas Aquinas, sort of those assumptions of being, right? The ontological argument of Anselm is based upon some very similar assumptions about metaphysics and about the reality of the world in which we live, namely that there is this ordered structure that extends from Christians would call it God, of course, right? This unmoved mover, or that which nothing greater can be conceived. And pagans would call it something else, whether it's the one, or whatever the case may be. For Plato, for Aristotle, they got different names. They got different words for sort of this singularity that is above all of reality. So the structure of the relationship of being between this singularity and then the rest of the created order as we understand it is one in which there is a commonality of being between the two, the singularity and then the many, the one and the many, we might say. So that relationship between the one and the many is going to be differently conceived, but it's going to have that basic assumption about metaphysics in common. And that's going to very much influence the way in which Christians approach apologetics, especially with unbelievers and atheists, especially, and in the attempt to prove the existence of God. Now, one of the things we should note that holds both the ontological and cosmological arguments in common is the idea that there is a generic notion of the divine being, right? A generic notion of God, a generic God, if you will. You'll notice that, and this is going to be important later when we talk about the need to reform apologetics, that the God that Anselm and Aquinas are trying to prove is a God that they assume they have in common with pagans. Okay, so they're going to say they're going to have this assumption that, let's say, that this pagan notion of a singularity, the one, okay, is just a pagan version of the God that Christians worship. Okay, now they're going to say there's a lot of error there, they don't quite get it right, but behind it, it's the same God. Okay, and so what Anselm and Aquinas are hoping to do is to be able to forge some common ground with the unbeliever. But the only way that Aquinas and Anselm can form a common ground with the unbeliever is to assume that the unbeliever's singularity, whatever that is, and the Christian's God are in fact the same being, the same entities that stand behind all of creation and all of being. Okay. And so they're going to have a common notion of, they believe they have a common notion of God with the unbeliever, and they get at it by way of arguing for a generic deity. In other words, they're going to say whether it's an uncaused cause or if it's that which nothing greater can be conceived. Okay, it's going to be a being without any descriptors or particularly distinct Christian notions. In other words, not the Trinity. Okay, they're going to begin with establishing the existence of a being, a highest being, a greatest being. but they're not going to begin with the revealed God of Scripture, who is triune as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Okay. And that's going to be an area where later on we're going to say we need particularly distinct approaches to apologetics, one that begins with the Trinity and doesn't see the Trinity as a sort of second level conclusion that we need to come to. Now, for Thomas Aquinas, it's very important to understand that for him, there's a two-step program to doing theology. There is what we might call the preambles of faith, and then the faith. Okay. The preambles of faith are the things that you say beforehand. Okay. It's the theology that you do quite independent and apart from special revelation, the Bible, in other words. Okay. And this is done on the basis of natural reason alone, philosophy, if you will. Okay. And this does not take into consideration special revelation at all. It's what we would call natural theology. Natural theology. Natural theology is those things that we can say about God quite prior to and independent of God's special revelation given to us, particularly in Scripture. Okay, so it's sort of a shared program with unbelievers. Natural theology is okay. It's first layer, if you will, of a two-layer cake. Okay, the first layer is natural theology on the basis of natural reason alone. Natural reason alone. The second layer is Christian theology that is done on the basis of special revelation. Okay, so for Thomas, when we're talking about doing apologetics, that's a first layer task. Okay, there you're establishing just basic principles that are in common with unbelievers. You kind of get the unbeliever on board through these common notions. That's another technical term you might want to know. Common notions. These are, I keep spelling things wrong. You know, you see it in the chat there, but you know what I'm saying, even if I spell it wrong. Common notions are notions that believers and unbelievers can share in common, right? You establish those first, then you get into Christian theology. You don't do any Christian theology up front, okay? Because that it is oftentimes assumed by Thomas Aquinas as begging the question, right? You can't just jump into Christian theology. You have to establish certain truths by reason alone at the beginning in order to pave the way, if you will, in order to pave the way to doing Christian theology. Okay. And that's where you establish common principles with pagans. Okay. And so that's a very important notion, this notion of natural theology as something that gets said beforehand on the basis of natural reasoning alone. Okay, that's how apologetics is being engaged, particularly at this time in the medieval church. Okay, that will become relevant and important as we move on into talking about the need for reforming apologetics. Okay, any questions, comments on what we've been saying thus far? Feel free to drop anything, any notes, questions into the chat. I'm just going to check my messenger real quick to see if Rocky has reached out to see what happened here. Okay, so Salih asked a question in messenger. So I just responded to that. All right. Good. Okay. Good stuff. I hope you all are tracking still okay, and all is well. So let me move to talk about I gotta figure out a way to get my notes back up here. And, oh, here it is. Okay. Okay, good. All right. So now don't forget this whole approach, okay, this natural theology approach to doing apologetics is the kind of thing that just sort of gets assumed throughout the Middle Ages. Um, oh, okay, there is a question. I'm sorry. Is the idea of Thomas Aquinas similar to Plato? Yeah, good question, Matthew. The much of what Thomas Aquinas has to say is built upon um, uh, ideas that he is very much borrowing mostly from Aristotle. So it's beyond us here. It's quite frankly beyond my own competence to articulate the differences between Plato and Aristotle. Although I could talk about that a little bit, um, but beyond our purview here. But technically, rather than Plato, people would say it's Aristotle who's most influential on Thomas Aquinas. Okay, good question. All right, let's continue to talk about the history of apologetics moving into the time of the Reformation. So, what happens at the Reformation? Okay, a lot's happening here at the Reformation. I mean, there is a critical look at the tradition, and there has been critical looks at the tradition leading up to the Reformation. So when the Reformation comes along, it's not like Martin Luther comes on the scene. He's like, I'm going to do something radical nobody has ever done before. I'm going to criticize the doctrine of the church and the Pope. This has actually been going on in the church for quite some time. And so when Martin Luther comes on the scene, it's not as if people have never heard criticisms of the church before or its doctrine. So, but when Luther comes on the scene, though, there is very much an open criticism of the way in which the church has done theology. Now it's not in one respect, it's not a radical challenge in the sense that Martin Luther is operating within the church. When he posts his 95 theses on the door at the Wittenberg Church, he's not doing something radical. It's sort of what you did in that day, because don't forget Wittenberg not only has a church but it has a university as well, and Luther's a professor at the university. So um, when Luther posts these points, he does so as a way of posting items for public debate, things for people to talk about and to debate. It would be not unlike social media today, and whether we're talking about Twitter, X, or Facebook or whatever. Sometimes people will post things on there that are controversial, and they do so as to have a public discussion, to have back and forth, to have an exchange of ideas. Luther was posting the 95 Theses in order to have an exchange of ideas, an academic debate about the teachings of Rome and the Pope, so forth and so on, particularly around the issue of indulgences. I mean, this was the thing that really got Martin Luther going. And part of the reason why he posted 95 Theses is because he's concerned about the whole idea of indulgences being sold by the Pope for the building of St. Peter's Basilica. He saw it as a corrupt thing. He thought it was wrong for the Pope to sell forgiveness in the form of indulgences, and so that, of course, sparks the Reformation. Part of the reason why um, uh, things blew up with Luther in a way that they didn't with previous attempts at criticizing the church is in part because of the printing press, the Gutenberg printing press, which was able to take Luther's 95 Theses, copy and print them in mass, and to distribute them throughout Germany. And of course, it didn't just get distributed in Germany, it made itself known throughout Europe, and eventually got into the hands of the Pope, and it really upset the Pope. So when you upset the Pope, things get interesting, right? Because the Pope has power, and he's going to not like the fact that he's been criticized. But more than that, his attempt to try to raise funds for St. Peter's Basilica through the selling of indulgences is being affected through the 95 Theses. So, he's losing sales, his income is decreasing. And so Luther poked the Pope at the very point where nobody likes to be poked, which is in your pocketbook. So once money starts going away from the Vatican, next thing you know, the Pope is going to be really, really upset and threatens Luther, eventually excommunicates him, so forth and so on. But the reason why I bring all of this up is to say that Luther's attempt to reform the church was nothing controversial in and of itself. People were doing this for years. But this one really exploded for various historical reasons. But the point is that once the Reformation gets started this way, and Luther starts to call into question Roman doctrine, it's important to recognize that really the whole system, the whole system upon which apologetics was built in the Middle Ages, begins to come under scrutiny, because Luther is known for criticizing Aristotle and just philosophy in general. So when you say, so during that period of time, if you say the word Aristotle, philosophy, or metaphysics, it all means the same thing. Okay, to attack philosophy is to attack Aristotle, is to attack metaphysics as a discipline. And so what Luther does is he calls into question the usefulness or the practicality or the legitimacy of philosophy for the church. And basically, Luther was not known for nuance, right? I mean, Luther was known for sort of these extreme over the top statements that are really generalizing, and Luther would say things like philosophies of the devil, or things like this, and he really didn't mean to dismiss the idea of love of wisdom, right? That's what philosophy is, simply the love of wisdom. Obviously, there's a Christian notion of the love of wisdom. It could be said that the book of Proverbs is biblical philosophy, right? Because it exhorts us to hate folly and to love wisdom. So obviously, there's a Christian notion of philosophy. There's a pagan notion of philosophy. But Luther's point is, listen, we've allowed Aristotle into the church, and it's a problem. And we need to move away from speculative thinking. Now, when he talks about speculative metaphysical thinking, he has a notion there, this whole idea of coming to a certain knowledge of God or a certain knowledge of theology on the basis of reason alone, so natural theology. Luther has in view a criticism of natural theology when he dismisses philosophy. Now, at the time of the Reformation, you also have John Calvin, and Calvin, of course, is Calvin is nuanced. He's a very careful theologian. He's not as dismissive as Luther is. At the same time, Calvin is not interested in doing the kind of natural theology that Aquinas was promoting, or Anselm, for that matter. You'll oop, okay, there we go. Good. You'll notice that if you look at the institutes of the Christian religion, Calvin's institutes, you'll notice there that in it um, uh, there is from the opening pages there is discussion about the knowledge of God. How is it that we know God? And what Calvin says is that the knowledge of God and the knowledge of ourselves, or the knowledge of the creature that we have of creation, the knowledge of creation, including ourselves, and the knowledge of God are coterminous with each other. What he's saying, okay, is that the knowledge of God comes through the knowledge of creation. That's his approach to natural theology. That's legitimate, right? Like we would want to say that if we're going to talk about natural theology, what we need to talk about is the knowledge of God that we gain through knowing the creation. Okay, that's what Reformed theologians would end up calling natural revelation, which is different than Aquinas's view of natural theology. How are they different? Aquinas believes that there is a process that we come to, that we engage in as intellectual beings, of natural reason, whereby through inferences and through a philosophical chain of reasoning come to a knowledge of God. Natural theology says that you don't need to go through that process. Every human being knows God instantly, simply by knowing himself and by knowing the creation around him. Okay, so that so that the knowledge of God is, for the Reformed, is never based on reason alone, but it is always based on revelation. Okay, for Thomas Aquinas, that's not the case. For Thomas Aquinas, as far as I could tell, he has no doctrine of natural revelation. He has a doctrine of the natural use of reason, natural reason. Okay, and that's not, natural reason is necessary to go through a process of logic in order to arrive at the conclusion at the end of that process of logic that there is a being, uncaused cause, who exists. What Calvin and the Reformed want to say is that on the basis of revelation, man knows the triune God instantly, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. There is no moment, there is no time in which man is dependent upon natural reason alone to come to a knowledge of God. He is dependent at every point in order to know God, to know the triune God, through revelation, particularly natural revelation. Okay, now that way, natural revelation, special revelation cohere for the Reformed. Okay, and particularly special revelation is necessary to interpret natural revelation, okay, in order to interpret it correctly. But still, nevertheless, natural revelation is sufficient to know God. Okay, so think about it with me as Adam. Let's say Adam is in the garden. Okay, he's created in the garden after the image and likeness of God. And at the first moment of consciousness, what does Adam know? Does Adam, let me put two options before you. Does Adam need to look at creation around him and, being mystified, wonder what it's all about, and then go through a process of logical reasoning whereby finally, maybe after some days, we don't know, after some days, finally at the end of thinking long enough and hard enough, he concludes that there is an unmoved mover? And even at that point, he does not yet know that that unmoved mover is triune, that he's the Trinity. He just knows that there's a higher generic being up there somewhere. But he doesn't know what that God is like. He doesn't know his attributes at all yet. He just simply knows he exists. And then he could go on and reason about what attributes this being has. Do you think that's the case? Or do you think, option number two, that at the moment when Adam had consciousness in the garden, he knew who he was and he knew who the God was that created him? Thomas Aquinas holds to position number one. The Reformed hold to position number two. Okay, understood? So that when man is created, at the moment of his creation, he is created with original knowledge, holiness, and righteousness. Okay, he knows the one true and living God. How do we know that? We'll talk about this a little bit more later, but we look at Romans chapter 1, verses 18 and following. And I'll just go ahead and read that here for you briefly. I don't want to spoil what I have to say later, and I'll say a lot more about Romans 1 later. But if you look at Romans 1, beginning of verse 18, it says this: "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." Verse 19. Why is it that they're suppressing the truth? How is it that they're suppressing the truth? Verse 19. "For what can be known about God is plain to them." Why is it plain to them? Because God has shown it to them. Verse 20. What has he shown? "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature," so his power and his nature, "have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made." So God's invisible attributes, his power and his nature. And let me ask you this, let me ask you this, is God's nature a generic singularity, or is it triune? It's triune. The nature of God is not a mere singularity. It is not merely the one, as Aristotle would call it, but it is the one and the many. The very nature of God is one and many. He is one in being, three in person, from the beginning. That is what is made known to man from the very beginning. So that the triune God is who is revealed through nature, and the triune God is the one who is known by man through nature. Okay, from the very beginning of creation. Okay, so let's go back to my hypothetical. Again, I'll restate it just to make sure we're all tracking. Okay, at the moment of Adam's consciousness, the alpha point of Adam's consciousness, at the very beginning of his consciousness, when he beholds creation, what does he know? Does he know the triune God as the one who created him and created everything around him instantly at the moment of his consciousness? Or does he first need to go through a process of natural reasoning alone to come to the conclusion that there is some singularity above him that created him? It's the first option, right? I know I've kind of reversed those from what I said before, but you get what it is, right? The knowledge of God is instantaneous, it's implanted in man, and it is revealed to man through the things that have been made. Okay? So it's innate, implanted, and instantaneous. Those are the three I's. I'm going to reverse the order. Instantaneous, implanted, and innate. We could also say, we could add a third I, immediate. Okay? Man himself is the revelation of God. He's made in the image of God. At no point that man functions cognitively, at no point is the knowledge of the triune God suspended, but it is known. It is known instantaneously. It is known as implanted in man. It is innate to man, and it is immediately known. God, the triune God, is immediately known. Now, that's the Reformed perspective. That's the Reformed position. Now, I'm not saying that there were not Reformed theologians, particularly after Calvin, who I'm not saying that there are no Reformed theologians after Calvin who used the arguments, the ontological or cosmological arguments for the existence of God. Those arguments, the ontological, cosmological arguments for the existence of God, are oftentimes called the classical arguments for the existence of God, sometimes called classical apologetics. Okay. Now, there were Reformed theologians after Luther, after Calvin, who did make use of the classical arguments for the existence of God. Although it becomes different in the hands of Reformed theologians than it is in the hands of Thomas Aquinas or Anselm. And we'll get into that maybe a little bit more later, although that need not detain us here. It's more of a side debate that's going on. But the whole thing is that that I want you to take away from at this point when we're talking about the Reformation is that there is a very different conception of nature moving from Thomas Aquinas to Calvin. Very different. Now, I'm not saying there aren't commonalities. I'm not saying there are significant, important points of overlap between Calvin and Aquinas. That's not what I'm saying. But there is a very different conception of nature between Thomas and Calvin. Okay? And it's this. For Thomas Aquinas, there is no natural revelation. Natural theology is on the basis of reason alone, natural reason alone. Okay. For Calvin, there is natural revelation, so that the knowledge of God is not by way of a process of natural reasoning, but is immediate, instantaneous, and innate to man. Okay. That's the difference in a nutshell. That's important. That'll be on the test. So make sure you take note of that, okay? The differences between Thomas and Calvin with regard to nature, okay? Very important stuff. All right, we've got about 9 minutes left. Just a quick pause to see if there are any questions. Just to remind you, as you're thinking of any questions, typing them in, I'm just going to ramble on a little bit more. Just remind you where we are. We're doing a history of apologetics to set the backdrop to show why it is needed that there be a reformation of apologetics, that the task of apologetics needs to become reformed because of the way in which it was practiced in the past. We want to make sure that we do our apologetics in a way that is in conformity with our Reformed doctrine, okay, and what we believe the Bible teaches. Okay, so we want to make the task of apologetics more and more biblical and less dependent upon pagan, unbelieving notions and ideas. Okay, that's where we're at. Okay, we good? Any questions? Okay, let me begin my next section on the history of apologetics. And we may not get very far, but that's okay. Let me begin. Let's see. Let's talk about, okay, by the time we get through the Reformation, we enter very quickly into what is called the modern period. And in the modern period, there are different attempts to try to use philosophy in order to prove the existence of God. Okay. And, you know, when you get to the modern period, you think of somebody like Rene Descartes. Okay. Descartes is trying to come at the question of epistemology, that is to say, the theory of knowledge, how it is that we know things. Descartes, and let me just drop his name in here real quick. It's kind of spelled funny, but it looks like Descartes, but his eyes pronounced Descartes. Um, Descartes is coming at the approach to epistemology in a new way. And what he wants to say is actually quite contrary to Thomas Aquinas. He's saying, I don't want to get any of my knowledge from outside of myself, okay? Because that can always be falsely interpreted by me. So what I need to do is to get into my own head and stay there and figure out, by way of a process of reasoning, exactly what it is I can know. And the only way that I can know something to be true is to know that I can't know, to doubt everything. Okay. So I'm going to doubt that I know anything. I'm going to doubt that I have knowledge of God, that I am living in such and such a century, that I see my dog laying on the carpet over here. I mean, he's going to deny that, he's going to doubt that he can know anything at all. But there's one thing he cannot doubt, and that he is doubting, right? And in order to doubt, you have to think. And so Descartes' conclusion is that if I think, then I must exist. I think, therefore I am. Okay. And so because he can think, he knows he's thinking because he's doubting, then he must exist. And then from there, he begins everything else that he comes to know. So think about how opposite that is from Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas goes through the process of reasoning in order to come to the conclusion that God exists, or at least an unmoved mover exists. Descartes begins with proving his own existence, not the existence of God. Okay, so that's a significant turn in the history of Western thought and philosophy and epistemology, not to mention metaphysics as well. But it's in the modern period where reason once again sort of takes on a new man-centered role. And you can see that in Descartes, right? How it's man-centered. Okay, he's there to prove his own existence, not the existence of God. He begins not with the existence of God, he begins with his own existence, right? And so reason then ends up becoming the calling card of the modern period. In order to be a good, modern, enlightened people, and I'll put that in there here as well, because this is the period that we're getting into called the Enlightenment. In the Enlightenment, to be a good, enlightened, rational person, you have to make your arguments on the basis of reason, not on the basis of old, outmoded philosophical speculations like you have in Aristotle. Or you can't begin with the special revelation of Christian doctrine either. As a matter of fact, what's going to happen during the middle, the Enlightenment period, is just the opposite. We're going to find ourselves in a time where Christianity and Christian doctrine will be restated in a way that is wholly in keeping with reason and not the Bible. Okay? Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, Immanuel Kant wrote a book called Religion Within the Bounds of Reason Alone. Religion within the bounds of reason alone. And what Kant does in that book is he goes through all the different aspects of Christian theology. And what he does is he tries to provide an enlightened alternative to those Christian doctrines. Okay. So whether we're talking about the existence, the attributes, the being of God, if he's talking about Christology and salvation, so forth and so on, Kant's going to recast the whole thing so that it is in keeping with the principles of the Enlightenment, not in keeping with the principles of Scripture. Okay? So you can see now with Kant the way in which there is a radical transition in the way in which we're not only doing theology, but in the way in which we're seeking to prove and authenticate the truthfulness of Christianity. Okay? The way in which he's going to try to prove the authenticity and legitimacy of Christianity is by recasting old doctrines to put them in keeping with Enlightenment principles. Okay? And that will set things up to talk about, as we will next week, the theologian Schleiermacher, Friedrich Schleiermacher, a German theologian who is the father. He is the father of modern liberalism. Let me qualify that. Modern theological liberalism. Schleiermacher. And we'll pick up, Lord willing, next week with Schleiermacher. All right. I have to go. It's 8:00, and y'all have been very attentive, and so I'm very thankful for that. And I'll close us with prayer, and then we'll pick up again same time next week, okay? I hope you brothers have a good and blessed evening, and looking forward to seeing you guys next week. Let's pray. Father, thank you for these things. We pray that you would continue to be with us to help us to think your thoughts after you. We pray that you would be with these dear brothers as they go on their way and they do their work and care for their families and so forth and so on. We pray your blessings upon them, upon us all, as we seek to glorify you throughout the course of our lives. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, sir. That's very nice. Very good. Thank you.
Good. Good night, y'all. Bye.
Yes. See you next week, God's willing.
See you next week.
Mm.